The shovel stopped mid-swing. Ruth Shady froze for about 3 seconds. It was 2017, Barranca province, northern Peru, and the late afternoon sun hit that hillside in a way that made everything look golden and unreal. The team had been digging that forgotten hill for months. Stones, mud, more stones, and then that, a wall. But not just any wall. A wall with drawings, reliefs carved directly into the dried clay. And what was drawn there made absolutely no sense. Pututus, shell trumpets, dozens of them, carved with disturbing precision, as if someone had frozen sound in time. Ruth looked at archaeologist Marco Machaque. He looked back. Nobody said anything because there was nothing to say. That shouldn't be there. That shouldn't exist, because if that was there, if those carvings were real, if that buried city was really 3,500 years old, then the history of Peru before the Incas was wrong, or incomplete, or we simply never really knew what happened in that piece of the world. Peñico, that was the name locals gave to that region. Nobody knew why. Nobody cared. It was just another forgotten place where nothing grew right and stones sprouted from the ground like crooked teeth. But under those stones, under that silence of centuries, there was an entire city. A city that existed 1800 years before Christ, before the Incas, way before. So before that, when the Incas started building Machu Picchu, Peñico had already been abandoned for over 2,000 years. Look at this. Wait, let me rephrase because this is important. 2,000 years. Think about what that means. When the Incas were at their peak building those stone cities we know today, Peñico was already ancient history to them, already legend, already forgotten. And here's where it gets weird, because if Peñico was there all this time, why didn't anyone know? Why didn't any Spanish chronicler mention it? Why didn't even the Incas themselves leave a record of this? Short answer, because we didn't look. We looked at Machu Picchu and thought that was the beginning. We saw Cusco and thought, okay, this is where it all started. But no, it didn't start there. It started way, way earlier. It started in places like Peñico, places that turned to dust before anyone even invented writing, 600 meters above sea level, on a hillside protected from floods and landslides, 200 kilometers north of Lima, in a region that today is dry and forgotten, but 3,500 years ago was something else. Had to be. Because nobody builds a city in the middle of nowhere. Nobody carves pututus on temple walls if that place doesn't mean something. And you know what Ruth Shady discovered? That Peñico wasn't an ordinary city. It was a trading post, a meeting point, a place where 3 worlds touched, the Pacific, the Andes, and the Amazon. People from the coast brought shells, salt, dried fish. People from the mountains brought potatoes, quinoa, llama wool. And from the east, from the jungle, came things we don't even really know what they were. Rare woods, macaw feathers, medicinal plants, maybe hallucinogens, maybe secrets. But there's another layer to this, because Peñico didn't come from nowhere. Peñico came from something, from someone. And this is where the story gets really disturbing. Corral. Ever heard of it? Probably not. Because Corral is the civilization nobody knows, but everyone should. 5,000 years old. Contemporary with the Egyptians, contemporary with the Sumerians, the oldest civilization in the Americas. 32 monuments, pyramids, irrigation systems, planned cities, and then nothing. Silence, abandonment. Why? Nobody knows. The most accepted theory talks about climate change, prolonged droughts, the kind of drought that kills crops, dries up rivers, forces people to choose between migrating or dying. And they migrated, left those urban centers that took generations to build and simply left. But where to? Where does an entire civilization go when it collapses? Peñico. The answer is Peñico. Ruth Shady believes Peñico is the continuation of Caral, that when those people abandoned their cities in the Supi Valley, they went up, literally, went higher, to more protected regions, more strategic ones, and rebuilt, not the same way, not the same size, but rebuilt, adapted, survived. 8 years of excavation, 18 identified structures, ceremonial temples, residential complexes, a circular central plaza that seems to have been the heart of everything, and in that plaza, those carved pututus, as if saying, this is where we gather, this is where sound matters, this is where we announce, celebrate, call, summon. And look, I keep thinking, why the shell? Why turn a shell into a horn? Why carve that specific object on the most important walls of the city? Because the shell comes from the Pacific. Because it represents the connection with the sea. Because blowing a pututu is literally blowing the ocean into the mountains. It's bringing the voice of the sea to where the sea never reaches. But that's just my theory. Nobody knows. Nobody can know. Because these people left no texts, left no names, left nothing written, left stones, left clay, left sculptures of people and animals, left shell necklaces, left questions, and I need to say something here. Some people think civilization starts with writing, that if there's no text, there's no real history, that these pre-Columbian peoples were primitive because they didn't invent the alphabet. And that, man, that's so wrong it hurts. Peñico had planned architecture, had organized trade, had complex rituals, had art, had identity, had everything a civilization needs to have, just didn't have letters. So what? Writing is a tool. It's useful, yes, but it's not what defines whether a people is advanced or not. What defines it is the capacity to organize, to create, to adapt, to survive in extreme conditions and still build something beautiful. And Peñico did that. For 1,000 years at least. 1,000 years, think about that. 1,000 years of people living in that place, being born, growing up, marrying, having children, dying. 1,000 years of caravans going up and down that hillside with goods. 1,000 years of pututus blowing at dawn. 1,000 years of stories that nobody wrote down, but everyone lived. And then silence. Again. Abandonment. Again. Because something happened. Something always happens, and Peñico became just another hill full of stones that nobody looked at twice, until 2017, until Ruth Shady hit that wall with her shovel, until drones flew over that hillside and showed what had been hidden all along, a circular structure, a pattern, a city. In July 2025, Peñico opened to the public. Tourists can now walk through those ruins, can touch those stones, can look at those carved pututus and ask themselves the same thing I ask myself. Who were these people? What did they dream about? What were they afraid of? We'll never know. Not completely, but we can look. We can dig. We can try to reconstruct the pieces. And maybe, just maybe, we'll realize that the history of the Americas doesn't start where we thought it did. That before the Incas there were other civilizations. That before Machu Picchu there was Peñico. That before Peñico there was Caral. And before Caral, well, we're still digging, but there's one question nobody's asking, and that question bothers me. If Peñico is the continuation of Caral, and if Caral collapsed because of climate, what happened to Peñico? Why was this city also abandoned? Was it the same reason? Did the climate change again? Or was it something else? And there's more. If 3 successive civilizations in the same territory collapsed, what does that say about that place? What does that say about the fragility of human societies when nature decides to change the rules of the game? We like to think we're in control. That technology protects us, that we've learned from the past. But have we? Because Caral had advanced technology for its time, so did Peñico, and still they disappeared, turned to dust, turned to forgotten memories, turned into the kind of story that only exists because someone had the patience to dig. Ruth Shady is 78 years old. She spent more than half her life digging through dry clay in Peru. And you know what she says when people ask why she keeps going? She says, every stone tells a story, that every collapsed wall is an erased sentence, and that her job isn't to invent those stories, it's to let them emerge. And look, this is about to get even stranger. Because when the team started mapping Peñico with drones and 3D imaging technology, they realized something. The city wasn't built randomly. There was a plan, a design. The main structures formed an almost perfect circle around that central plaza. Like everything converged there, like that was the point that mattered. And have you ever thought about what it means to build in a circle? Because we build in squares today. Blocks, grids, straight lines. But they didn't. They built in circles. And a circle has no beginning or end. A circle is continuous movement. A circle is inclusion. Everyone on the edge sees everyone else. Nobody's hidden. Nobody's left out. Maybe that's why it worked. Maybe that's why they managed to keep 3 different cultures coexisting in the same space. Pacific, Andes, Amazon. 3 worlds that have nothing to do with each other. Different climate, different food, completely different way of living. And yet, they traded, negotiated, coexisted. Tell me in the comments. Had you heard of Peñico before? Because I bet you hadn't. I bet most people didn't even know there was civilization in Peru before the Incas. And look, that's not your fault. It's the fault of how we learn history. We learn about Rome, about Egypt, about Greece. But pre-Columbian America, oh, that's always Incas and Mayans. Done. End of story. But it's not the end. It didn't even start there. And if you're finding this as disturbing as I am, leave a like and subscribe, because there's more forgotten history like this around here. Because we're going deep into this rabbit hole. We're digging. But back to that plaza, 18 meters in diameter, compacted stone floor, and on the inner walls, those reliefs, pututus, dozens of them, but not just pututus. There were also human figures, small ones, stylized, with their arms raised as if they were dancing, or praying, or celebrating something we'll never know what it was. Marco Machaque, the archaeologist who coordinated part of the excavation, said in an interview that those sculptures had something unsettling about them. It wasn't the style. The style was simple, almost childlike. It was the repetition. There were dozens of identical figures, as if saying, we were many, we were together. We did this as a group, and this fits with what we know about pre-Incan societies. They weren't individualistic. They didn't have absolute kings like Europeans had. They didn't have a power pyramid with one person at the top, commanding everyone. They were collective. Decisions were made as a group. Work was done in teams. You didn't build your house alone. Everyone built everyone's house. Does that sound too utopian? Maybe, but it works. It worked for 1,000 years in Peñico. It worked even longer in Caral. And it still works in some Andean communities today. They call it Aini, reciprocity. You help me today, I help you tomorrow. Nobody owes anything because everyone owes everything. Peñico had that logic, that system, and that's why it could be what it was, a trading point, a neutral place. Because nobody controlled it, nobody owned it. Everyone passed through, everyone contributed, everyone took something and left something. But there's one detail most reports don't mention, and this detail changes everything. When archaeologists analyze the objects found in Peñico, pottery, tools, food, remains, they realize there were things from the Amazon, but not from the Peruvian Amazon, from the Brazilian Amazon, from the other side of the Andes. Wait a second, let me explain better, because this is absurd. The Andes reach over 6,000 meters altitude at some points. No roads, no bridges, no GPS. And 3,500 years ago, these people were crossing that on foot, carrying cargo, trading goods with people who lived 1,000 kilometers away. How? How did they do it? How did they know the way? How did they negotiate without a common language? Because it wasn't just one people. It was several, each with their own language, each with their own customs. And still, it worked. The most obvious answer is time. These routes were built over generations. It wasn't someone who woke up one day and decided, I'm going to cross the Andes. It was a slow process. One valley at a time, one mountain at a time, until eventually, someone who knows someone who knows someone on the other side, and Peñico was in the middle of that. Literally, geographically in the center of this trade network, connecting completely different ecosystems. And that's no coincidence. Nobody builds a city at 600 meters altitude by chance. They chose that place because from there you could see who was coming up. You could protect yourself. You could control. No, wait. Control is the wrong word. You could facilitate. You could mediate. You could be the bridge. Because there's a huge difference between being a trading post and being an empire. Empires control. Charge taxes, impose rules, trading posts facilitate, offer space, offer security, offer neutrality. And Peñico was that. It wasn't a center of power, it was a center of exchange. And it works. It works so well that after Peñico was abandoned, other peoples did the same thing. The Wari, the Tiwanaku, the Incas themselves, all of them understood that controlling the Andes trade routes isn't about force. It's about being in the right place, about being useful, about being necessary. But here comes the part that makes me uneasy. If Peñico was so important, if it was in the perfect location, if it had everything to keep existing, why did it stop? The official theory talks about climate change. Again, it's always that, and look, it makes sense, because the Andes are unstable. They have El Niño, they have droughts, they have floods, they have earthquakes, they have volcanoes. They literally have everything that can go wrong climatically. But I think there's something else. I think these civilizations collapsed, not just because the climate changed, but because they depended too much on a fragile balance. Think about it. Peñico depended on caravans. If the caravans stopped coming, Peñico lost its purpose. And why would caravans stop coming? Because the cities of origin collapsed. Because the routes became too dangerous. Because there was nothing left to trade. It's like a chain of dominoes. Corral falls, Peñico gets weaker. Other cities on the coast disappear, Peñico loses customers. Climate changes in the Amazon, Peñico loses suppliers, and eventually there's nobody left, just stones, just silence, just those pututus carved on the wall reminding us that once, a long time ago, someone was blowing. But there's something poetic about that too, because Peñico left no texts, left no names of kings, left no lists of conquests. It left musical instruments carved in clay. It left the image of sound. And maybe that says more about them than any text could. That what mattered wasn't who was in charge. It was what connected. It was what echoed through the mountains. It was the voice that called people close. And that voice went silent for 3,500 years, until Ruth Shady started digging. July 2025, Peñico opens to the public for the first time. And you know what happened? Almost nothing. A few tourists, a few photos, a few articles in local newspapers, and that's it. The world kept spinning like nothing had changed. Like an entire 3,500-year-old city hadn't just been revealed, that completely rewrites what we know about ancient Peru. This pisses me off deeply, because if this were in Egypt, if this were in Greece, if this were anywhere in Europe or the Middle East, this would be world headlines. But it's Peru. It's South America. It's that continent the world still treats as if it were secondary in human history, as if the civilizations here didn't count the same way. And look, I'm not being dramatic, it's literally like that. We learn in school that the first civilizations emerged in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China. Done. Those are the four, the cradles of civilization. But what about Corral? Corral is contemporary with all of those, 5,000 years old, pyramids, planned cities, and nobody talks about it. Nobody teaches it, nobody knows. And Peñico is Corral's daughter. It's proof that that civilization didn't just disappear. It migrated, adapted, survived, and continued existing for another 1,000 years. This should be in every history book, but it's not. Damn, sorry, I got carried away, but it's just, man, this matters. This changes the narrative. This shows that the Americas weren't behind compared to the rest of the world. They were on the same level. We just never gave them credit. But back to the city itself, one of the most fascinating things archaeologists found were the remains of residential structures, houses, or what's left of them. And these houses tell a very different story from what we imagine when we think of ancient city. First, they were small, like really small, 10, 12 square meters max. One room, sometimes two, packed earth floor, adobe and stone. Walls, thatched roof that disappeared millennia ago. No luxury, no ostentation, just the necessary. And that says a lot, because when we look at ancient civilizations, we always look for the palaces, the giant temples, the tombs full of gold. We look for hierarchy, we look for inequality, we look for proof that there's always been rich people commanding poor people. But in Peñico, there's none of that. The houses are all similar. Small, simple, functional. Is there a bigger house? There is. One structure in the center that was probably used for collective meetings or rituals, but it's not a palace. It doesn't have excessive decoration. It doesn't have accumulated wealth. It's just bigger, because it needed to fit more people. And then Marco Machaque made an observation I thought was brilliant. He said Peñico seems to have been built by people who were afraid of standing out too much, who valued the collective above the individual, who saw ostentation as something negative, not positive. Think about the difference. Think about what that means. Because in the same period in Egypt, the pharaohs were building pyramids with burial chambers full of treasures. In Mesopotamia, kings had palaces with dozens of rooms. In China, emperors were buried with terracotta armies. And in Peru, they built equal houses. Because the idea wasn't to stand out, it was to belong. But that doesn't mean there was no complexity, because when archaeologists analyze the objects found in these houses, that's where the diversity appears. Pacific shells in one house, Andes obsidian in another, Amazon macaw feathers in another. Each family, each group, had access to things from different places, as if everyone participated in that trade network, as if everyone benefited. And, look at this, they found pottery, lots of pottery, pots, bowls, jars. And you know what's interesting? No two pieces are identical. They all have small variations in shape, decoration, texture, as if each person made their own, as if there was no mass production, as if each object was unique because it was made by someone specific for a specific purpose. This is the opposite of what we associate with advanced civilization. We think standardization, efficiency, assembly lines, but they didn't. They made everything individually, and it still worked. They still maintained an entire city for 1,000 years. There's something beautiful about that. There's something we've lost, because today everything's the same. Every cup is identical. Every plate came from the same factory. Every building uses the same materials. We gained efficiency, but lost individuality, lost the mark of the human hand on things, and they didn't. Every object they made carried the mark of who made it. It was unique. It was personal. Wait, are you following me? Because I know I'm rambling, but there's a philosophical layer to this that fascinates me. These people had a completely different relationship with objects, with space, with community. And we kind of forgot that there are other ways to organize a society. We think the way we live today is the only possible one, the natural one, the inevitable one. But it's not. Peñico proves it's not. Anyway, there were also tools, obsidian knives, stone scrapers, bone needles, no metal, because metallurgy hadn't reached that region yet. Or if it had, it was too incipient to leave traces, so everything was stone, bone, wood. Materials nature offered, materials you picked up, shaped and used until they wore out. And there's one specific tool that appears in almost every house, a type of grinding stone, concave, worn in the center from repeated use. And when they analyzed the microscopic residues stuck to these stones, they found quinoa, corn, potato, the same foods Andean peoples eat today. 3,500 years later, the same diet, the same food base. This makes me kind of emotional. It's weird. But thinking that someone in Peñico, 3,500 years ago, woke up in the morning, grabbed a grinding stone, ground quinoa, made dough, cooked it, and that today, in 2026, there are people in Peru doing exactly the same thing. Same plant, same method, same stone maybe. There's continuity in that. There's resistance. There's something that survived empires, colonizations, attempts at erasure. Food, the way of preparing it. Knowledge that passes from mother to daughter for 100 generations. Without ever being written, just practiced. And then silence again, because as much as we find objects, stones, walls, food remains, we'll never know what they thought. We'll never know how they explained the world, what stories they told, what fears they had, what gods they worshipped, or if they worshipped gods, or if they had another way of understanding the sacred. The Pututus suggest ritual, suggest ceremony, suggest that sound was important, but what exactly? Call to ancestors, harvest, celebration, danger warnings, farewell to the dead, all of that, none of that? We project. It's inevitable. We look at those reliefs and imagine what they meant based on what we know about other cultures. But that's not an answer. It's speculation. It's us trying to fill the void with our own fears and hopes. And maybe that's exactly what should bother us. Not what we know about Peñico, but what we'll never know. The silence that no excavation can break. There's a question nobody wants to ask out loud, but I'm going to ask it. If Peñico was so well located, so strategic, so important to the Andes trade network, why was it abandoned and more? Why does every civilization in that region eventually collapse? Corral lasted 1,000 years. Peñico lasted 1,000 years. Then came the Chavin, lasted a few centuries. Then the Moche lasted a few centuries. Then the Wari, the Tiwanaku, each in their own corner, each with their own time. And all of them eventually became ruins. The Incas were the last ones. And only because the Spanish arrived before they collapsed on their own. Because they would have. Eventually they would have. Because that's the pattern. In that region, in that climate, in that impossible geography, everything that goes up must come down. Everything that blooms must wither. Why? The easy answer is climate, El Niño, droughts, floods, earthquakes. The Andes are geologically unstable. The climate is unpredictable. You can have 10 years of good rain, and then comes a 5-year drought that kills everything, kills the crops, dries the rivers, forces people to migrate or die. And when people migrate, cities become empty, become ghosts. But I think it's more than that. I think there's something structural, something about the way these civilizations were organized that made them vulnerable. And look, I'm not saying this to diminish them. I'm saying it because it's important to understand. Because maybe we're making the same mistakes. Peñico depended on trade. It was literally sustained by exchange. People from the coast brought fish. People from the mountains brought potatoes. People from the jungle brought feathers and plants. And everyone benefited, but what if one of those ends stops working? What if the coastal city collapses? What if the jungle route becomes impassable? What if the mountains stay covered in snow too long? Peñico stops making sense. Because without trade, without the caravans, without the constant flow of people and goods, what you have is a bunch of small houses on a 600-meter hillside where almost nothing grows. What you have is an exposed, vulnerable, unsustainable place. And I bet that's what happened. I bet it wasn't a single event. It wasn't an earthquake that destroyed everything. It wasn't a drought that killed everyone. It was slow. It was gradual. It was the coastal city that stopped sending caravans. It was the Amazon route that became too dangerous. It was the flow that decreased, until it stopped. And then people start leaving. First the younger families, then the traders, then everyone who still had energy to start over somewhere else. And what's left are the old ones, the stubborn ones, those who can't imagine life anywhere else. Until eventually, nobody's left. Just stones, just silence, just the wind crossing that circular plaza where dozens of people once gathered to blow pututus. Depressing? Maybe, but realistic, because that's exactly what happens. When cities lose their purpose. Look at Brazil. How many small towns are emptying out right now? Young people leaving, businesses closing, schools without students. It's the same pattern, just at a different speed. The difference is that today we have technology, we have transportation, we have instant communication. But 3,500 years ago, if your city depended on caravans that took weeks to arrive, and those caravans stopped coming, you were isolated, completely, irreparably. And there's another detail. When archaeologists excavated the most recent layers of Peñico, the last ones before total abandonment, they found something disturbing. The constructions became more careless, the walls less aligned, the floors less compacted, as if people had lost the will, as if they already knew this wasn't going to last. That gives me chills, because it's a sign of collective resignation. It's a sign of a society that looks to the future and sees nothing. That stops investing. That stops maintaining. That simply gives up. And look, I keep thinking, did they know? Did the last generation that lived in Peñico have awareness that they were the last? Did they look at the pututus carved on the walls and think, our grandparents made this when they still believed? Damn, that's too heavy. But it's real. Because it happened, not once, several times, in that same region, with different peoples at different times. The pattern is the same. Flourishing, peak, decline, abandonment, forgetting, until someone like Ruth Shady shows up 3,500 years later, with a shovel, with patience, with stubbornness, and starts digging, and the stones start speaking again, not with words, but with shapes, with reliefs, with the simple existence of having been arranged that way in that place at that specific moment in human history. And you know what that proves? That forgetting isn't permanent, that silence can be broken, that even after millennia buried, a city can exist again. Not in the same way, not with the same people, but as memory, as evidence, as proof that once, a long time ago, there was life there. But there's a cruel irony to this too, because Peñico was discovered in 2017, opened to the public in 2025. And how many people visited? A few thousand, maybe less. While Machu Picchu receives over 1 million tourists a year. While everyone knows what the Incas are, but almost nobody knows what Corral was. Why do we value some ruins more than others? Why is Machu Picchu worth more than Peñico? Because it's bigger, because it's prettier, because it's more convenient for the narrative we want to tell about lost civilizations and mysterious empires? Or is it because Machu Picchu has giant, perfectly fitted stones and Peñico has peeling adobe and dried mud? Is it that we only value what visually impresses? Is it that history only matters if it's photogenic? I think so. I think we're that superficial. We prefer the spectacle. We prefer the monumental. We want to be impressed. And Peñico doesn't impress. Peñico is humble. Peñico is small. Peñico is that kind of place you visit and think, is that all? But that's precisely why Peñico is important, because it's not about size, it's not about grandeur, it's about continuity, it's about adaptation, it's about a people who saw their previous civilization collapse and decided, let's try again differently in another place. And they tried, and it worked. For 1,000 years, 1,000 years, longer than most modern cities will exist, longer than the United States has existed, longer than Brazil has existed, 1,000 years of people waking up, working, eating, loving, fighting, dying on that specific piece of Andean hillside. And then it ended, like everything ends. Like everything will eventually end, including the cities we live in today, including the civilizations we think are invincible, including everything we've built, thinking it would last forever. Nothing lasts forever. Peñico proves that, but it also proves something else, that even when it ends, even when it turns to dust, even when it's forgotten for 3,500 years, it can still be remembered, can still be rediscovered, can still teach something to whoever has the patience to listen. And the lesson is this: fragility. Every civilization is fragile. Every city depends on delicate balances: food, water, trade, climate. Take away one of those, and everything crumbles. Slow, inevitable, like Peñico crumbled, like Corral crumbled, like everything that came before and everything that will come after will eventually crumble too. Depressing again? Maybe, but also liberating. Because if nothing lasts forever, then it doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be monumental. It doesn't need to impress anyone. It just needs to work. As long as it can, however it can. Like Peñico worked, Ruth Shady has a photo on her office wall. A photo from 2017, her kneeling in front of that first wall with the carved pututus, hands still dirty with earth, and she's smiling. That kind of smile from someone who just understood something important, from someone who just touched something that was lost and has now been found. I saw that photo in a report and stared at it for about 5 minutes, because there's something deeply human in that moment. She spent decades digging Corral, decades proving that civilization existed, decades fighting to get people to pay attention, and then she finds Peñico and realizes it didn't end, that Corral didn't simply disappear, that there was continuation, that there were people who resisted, who migrated, who rebuilt. This changes everything, because the narrative we like to tell about ancient civilizations is always about total collapse. Rome fell, done, over. The Maya vanished, the end. Angkor was abandoned, nothing remained. We love these stories of absolute endings, of mysterious disappearance, and they were never heard from again. But that's not how it works. It never was. People don't disappear. They migrate, they adapt, they take their stories, their techniques, their beliefs somewhere else, and start again, differently, with another name. But they continue. Peñico is proof of that. It's not a completely new civilization that emerged from nowhere. It's the continuation of Corral, the same construction techniques, the same social organization, the same pututus, as if saying, we may have lost the city, but we didn't lose who we are. And look, I think we need this kind of story right now, because we live in a time where it feels like everything's falling apart. Climate changing, economy unstable, society fragmented, and the temptation is to look at that and think, okay, it's over, there's no going back. But Peñico says something else. Peñico says you can rebuild, that you can take the pieces of what was and assemble something new, not the same, not in the same place, but something that works, at least for a while, 1,000 years. They had 1,000 years. 1,000 years of people living in that place nobody remembers. 1,000 years of lives that weren't recorded in any book, but were real. That mattered to those who lived them. That were everything those people knew. And when it ended, when Peñico was finally abandoned, Did the last person to leave look back? Did they close the door of their house and think nobody will ever live here again? Did they take something as a memory, a shell, a stone, a piece of pottery, something to carry, something to remember? Or did they just leave without looking back, because looking back hurts too much, because it's easier to move forward and pretend the past didn't exist, that it doesn't matter, that it's gone, but it matters. It mattered, because 3,500 years later, someone like Ruth Shady shows up and says, "This needs to be remembered," and starts digging, and doesn't stop until she finds it. And now, Peñico exists again. Not the way it was. Nobody lives there anymore. Nobody trades goods in that circular plaza. Nobody blows pututus at dawn calling the sun. But it exists as memory, as evidence, as proof that there were people there who mattered. And you, what do you think of all this? Do you think we should give more attention to places like Peñico? Or is Machu Picchu already enough? Do we need to know all the forgotten civilizations? Or is it better to focus on the ones that are already famous? Tell me in the comments, because I honestly don't know the answer. I know Peñico fascinates me. I know I keep thinking about those people who lived there without knowing they'd one day be forgotten. I know this bothers me and enchants me at the same time. Leave a like if you'd never heard of Peñico before this video, and subscribe because there's more forgotten history like this around here. Stories of places that existed, flourished and disappeared without leaving names in books, but that left stones, left clay, left questions. And if you know someone who likes this kind of thing, ancient history, archaeology, mysteries of the past, share it. Because the more people know Peñico exists, the better chance it has of not being forgotten again. Because the biggest fear isn't being forgotten once, it's being forgotten twice. It's being rediscovered and still not mattering. It's being there, exposed, accessible, visitable, and still being ignored. Being just another place nobody knows about. Just another ruin among so many others. And maybe that's what the carved pututus mean. Maybe they're not about ritual, maybe they're about memory, about making noise, about shouting loud enough so that someone, at some point, even if it's 3,500 years later, hears. And we heard. Ruth Shady heard. You just heard. And now Peñico is no longer just a pile of stones on a forgotten hillside. It's a story. It's a connection with people who lived so long ago you can't even really imagine it, but who were real. Who woke up in the morning, who ground quinoa, who talked, who laughed, who cried, who loved, who died, like you, like me, like everyone who's ever existed and who will still exist. And one day, maybe 3,500 years from now, someone will dig through the ruins of our civilization, will find our objects, our collapsed buildings, our remains, and will try to understand who we were, what mattered to us, why we built the way we built. And maybe they won't understand. Maybe they'll look at our skyscrapers and think, why did they make everything so tall? Maybe they'll look at our cell phones and not understand what they were for. Maybe they'll look at the way we organize cities and find it weird, inefficient, strange, like we look at Peñico and find it strange, like we don't understand why they carved pututus, why they built in circles, why they valued the collective above the individual. But that doesn't mean they were wrong. It just means they were different, that they had other values, other fears, other hopes, and it worked for 1,000 years until it didn't work anymore. Until they had to leave, until Peñico became just another place where the wind blows through empty walls, and the wind still blows. Every day, crossing that circular plaza, passing over those carved pututus, as if carrying the sound back, as if there was still someone there to listen. But there isn't. There's only silence, only stones, only Ruth Shady and her team measuring, cataloguing, trying to understand. And there's only us, here, now, listening to a story about people who don't exist anymore, but who once mattered as much as we matter now. And maybe that's it. Maybe the lesson of Peñico isn't about greatness. isn't about leaving monuments that last forever. It's about simply existing, living, doing what you can while you can, and trusting that even if one day we're forgotten, someone will dig, someone will remember, someone will say our name again, even if it takes 3,500 years. Peñico, the city nobody knew about, the city that existed before the Incas, the city that was forgotten and rediscovered, the city that's still there, silent, waiting for more people to pay attention. Now you know. Now you're part of this. Now when someone says ancient Peru, you won't just think of Machu Picchu. You'll think of Peñico too, of those small houses, of that circular plaza, of those carved pututus that nobody blows anymore but are still there, silent witnesses of 1,000 years of life that happened and ended and was forgotten and was remembered. And that's already something. That's already more than nothing. That's already a way of keeping alive something that died so long ago.